y para mí es pues un placer el presentar y dar la bienvenida al conferenciante de esta tarde, el doctor Peter Humfrey, profesor emérito de la Universidad de St. Andrews en Escocia, donde enseñó durante más de 20 años, donde ejerció su magisterio y donde pues, tuvo magníficos discípulos. El profesor Peter Humfrey es uno de los mayores especialistas mundiales en pintura veneciana. A él se deben monografías fundamentales sobre pintores como Cima da Conegliano, como Tiziano o como Lorenzo Lotto. Su libro de 1997 pues es un verdadero referente para todos aquellos que quieran dedicarse a Lorenzo Lotto. Es también autor de estudios sobre el altar en Venecia y ha sido comisario de numerosas exposiciones, entre ellas también, y junto con Mauro Lugo, que está con nosotros y que mañana dará una conferencia, pues de la magnífica exposición dedicada a Lorenzo Lotto que tuvo lugar entre los años 1997 y 1999 en Washington, Bérgamo y París, y que supuso un redescubrimiento del pintor después de bastantes décadas de semiolvido, por lo menos en el terreno de las exposiciones. Ha sido comisario también de una exposición celebrada en la National Gallery de Escocia, dedicada precisamente al coleccionismo de pintura veneciana en Escocia, a la exposición dedicada a los tesoros del Museo de Glasgow, y pues, su labor se ha visto recompensada de miles de formas, entre otras cosas también por el gobierno italiano. Hoy simplemente quería darle las gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación y les voy a hablar sobre el gusto por las obras de Paolo Veronés en la corte de Carlos I de Inglaterra, un tema que en principio puede parecerles un poco lejano, pero que como verán no lo es tanto y que explica por qué algunas de las obras de Veronés que tenemos en el Prado llegaron a España. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you, Miguel Falomir, for this very kind introduction, and thank you very much to the audience for coming to hear me on this exceptionally beautiful June evening when you could be outside. And I'd just like to also begin by apologizing for not speaking Spanish, but I think it's better if I speak in English. But there is a Spanish dimension to my talk, even though it doesn't appear in the title. But my main focus is naturally on London, and I would like to begin with this view of the exterior of the Royal Academy of Arts in London in March of this year, when there was a very beautiful exhibition on King Charles I, King and Collector. And this refocused public attention on the extraordinary cultural achievements of the reign of Charles I. Now, politically, of course, his reign was a complete disaster, and it ended in the catastrophe of the Civil War. But during a brief period in the 1620s and 1630s, London became a leading centre for the collecting and patronage of art, and especially of painting. The collection of Charles I had more than 1,000 items in it, all of them dispersed after he was executed in 1649. And so the exhibition in London could only show a very small selection from his collection. And in fact, the star of the show was not an old master, but contemporary painter Van Dyck, whose portrait in three views you saw on the banner outside. And while we have this image up, by the way, the beautiful Lorenzo Lotto in the exhibition, a goldsmith in three faces, also belonged to, it wasn't in the London exhibition, but it belonged to Charles I and acted as an immediate inspiration for this portrait by Van Dyck. Actually, the Lotto was believed at that time to be by Titian, who who was the king's favorite old master. But despite generous loans, including from the Prado, the exhibition really couldn't do justice to the quantity and quality of the old masters in the royal collection in these years, the 1620s and 1630s. Titian was fairly well represented, but Correggio, another of the most highly regarded old masters of the period, with only one painting, and there was nothing there by Raphael, unless you count his designs for, tapestries after Raphael's designs. Now, another of the 16th century masters that were very greatly admired in the early 17th century by Charles and his fellow royal and aristocratic collectors was my subject this evening, Paolo Veronese. Here is the only example by Veronese in the exhibition, but his work was greatly sought after by other European collectors, including King Philip IV of Spain, and we have a letter of 1646 which the king wrote to Alonso de Cárdenas, who was the Spanish ambassador in London, because the king had heard of the forthcoming sale of one of Charles's courtiers, the Duke of Buckingham, and perhaps by 1646, King Philip may well also have suspected that Charles's own pictures would come on the market soon. Anyway, Philip asked Cárdenas to find pictures for him from these sales, and he asked him to look for originals by Titian or Veronese or other old painters of distinction. Que sean originales de Tiziano, Paolo Veronés o otras pinturas antiguas de opinión. Now, of course, Philip already had very good paintings by Titian. You can see in the collection here for yourselves. But he had very few Veroneses, and in fact, the only Veronese that he had, which he inherited from the collection of the Duke of Lerma, the favorite of Philip III, was this picture, which he gave as a diplomatic gift to Charles when Charles came to Madrid in 1623 to woo the king's sister, the Infanta Maria. So Charles went home with this, and it may be that in 1646, when 2 decades later, when Philip was on the lookout for paintings by Veronese, he was thinking that this was a good moment to get this one back, which in fact he didn't succeed in doing, but he did get a number of other paintings at the time, including this wonderful Titian of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles I of Spain, which for some incredible reason he gave to Charles in 1623, but managed to get back after the king's execution. And these two pictures were hung opposite each other in the exhibition at the Royal Academy in London. And there were good examples of the work of Veronese in the other main collections in London at this time, that of Charles himself, but also of the Earl of Arundel, the Duke of Buckingham, and also the Duke of Hamilton. And I'm going to talk about all these four collectors. But before 1649, before the execution of the king, about the end of the Civil War, though I've calculated there were about 60 paintings by Veronese in London, which is more than anywhere else outside Venice. It is certainly more than, well, as I've just implied, in the Spanish royal collection or in the imperial collection in Vienna. But after the catastrophe of the Civil War, many of them, most of them, in fact, ended up in Vienna or in the imperial collections in Vienna or Prague, but some of them came to Spain, and I'm going to mention some of these this evening. Now, about 10 years before Charles's visit to Madrid in 1623, there occurred probably the first important shipment of Venetian paintings to London. In the 16th century, the previous century, it had been almost impossible to buy paintings from Italy because of the religious divide and the fact that English collectors were not allowed to travel on the continent, especially not into to Catholic countries. But in 1613, there was a consignment of 15, most of which were bought by the Earl of Arundel. And here is a portrait of him by Rubens, now in Boston. Now, unfortunately, there were 5 paintings of Veronese by Veronese in this consignment, and unfortunately their titles are vague. 2, for example, are called poetical histories, which means that they were mythologies, but it doesn't even say what the subjects were. But the other three are a little bit more precise. They seem to have been scenes from the life of Hercules. Well, no, in 1613 they're called Scenes from the Life of Hercules. And since we know that Arundel bought them, I've been able to identify or suggest identifications for 3 of them, which appear in the inventory of the Earl of Arundel of 1655. Now, this lists in Italian La nascita d'Ercole, the birth of Hercules, and a Iola ed Ercole, Iola and Hercules. And also it mentions a Virtu et Vizio, virtue and vice. And all 3 of these were bought by Cardenas for Luis de Haro, and for his own for Haro's own collection, but with the idea perhaps that they would eventually pass to the king. Now, the records show that these 3 paintings weren't all of exactly the same size. In fact, the birth of Hercules was much larger than the other 2 and included many figures. It's a bit hard to visualize this painting. Why would the birth of Hercules be large and need a lot of figures? But anyway, this is how it's described. But the other 2 had only 3 figures each, and they were described as a pair. And we know that Luis de Haro kept the larger painting, the birth, but he gave the smaller pair to Philip. And I would suggest that these 2 pictures that had belonged to Arundel and that come to London in 1613 were these 2. At the top, this is now thought to be just an allegory, but it corresponds very well to the idea of virtù e vizio. And it's true that the boy in the middle doesn't look very Herculean. He looks like he's a boy sort of dressed up in contemporary costume, but nevertheless, it is somebody who is a young man who's trying to decide whether he's going to follow an austere path of virtue or the luxurious path of vice. And of course, this is a story that goes back to a tale that was told of Hercules. And so one can easily imagine that the compiler of the inventory in 1513 thought that this picture represented the choice of Hercules. And this other one is now is now thought to represent the family of Cain, and it's a very rare subject indeed. It's hard to think of any parallels. And again, I think you can see why a compiler of 1613 might think that this represents Hercules and his wife, Iola. He's wearing a skin and he's got a club, and this, of course, is the outfit very often worn by Hercules. Except Hercules and Iola didn't have a child, and so this is an argument against this being what the subject is meant to be. But again, it's easy to see how it was thought that this is what the subject represented. Anyway, all 5 of these paintings by Veronese, acquired by Arundel, were in Arundel's town palace on the Strand between 1613 and his departure from England at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1642. So these 2 pictures are of great interest, if I'm right in connecting them with the 1613 inventory. They're of great interest as the earliest Veroneses in London. They're rather modest in scale, as you will know, and they're not particularly spectacular by Veronese's standards. But you can see some things that are very characteristic of Veronese, this magnificent brocade curtain here and this white sort of Palladian-looking architecture, which are features that you would connect with Veronese and may well have prompted a greater enthusiasm for, or provoked an interest in Veronese among other collectors in London in these years. Now, Arundel is very important in the history of collecting in England. He's seen as a very important pioneer. He was considerably older than Charles, and in some respects he acted as a sort of mentor for him. Arundel was very discriminating as a collector. He chose very slowly and carefully. So he was a true aesthete, and his taste was quite Catholic. It wasn't just for Italian paintings, but also for Northern European paintings. He had particular taste for Dürer and Holbein, and also for drawings. And he was also the only one of these 4 collectors I'm going to talk about to go to Italy. He had a huge admiration for Palladio, but unlike the other 3, he never went to Spain, because the other 2, Buckingham and Hamilton, came with Charles on his ill-fated trip to Madrid in 1623. Arundel's posthumous inventory lists 25 works by Veronese. It's quite difficult to know how accurate the attributions are, because they're not very easy to trace, because the descriptions are so vague on the whole. And actually, the best documented episode of Arundel's pursuit of paintings by Veronese is a report that he offered 2,000 pistols. I'm not quite sure how much a pistol is, but I think at least £1, for the magnificent painting of the martyrdom of St. George there on the left, which was then and still is in the Church of San Giorgio in Braida in Verona. His agent, Petty, seems to have been in charge of making this offer to the canons of San Giorgio in 1637. And it's been suggested quite intriguingly that Arundel, who was the senior aristocrat, the senior member of the English nobility, and therefore he held a special position in the Order of Chivalry, the Knighthood of the Garter. And this is you've seen this on television recently. This was the seat of the Knights of the Garter, and it's been suggested that Arundel wanted to give this huge painting, which he couldn't have fitted into his palace in the Strand, to St. George's in Windsor. That would have been wonderful for the English, but fortunately the canons didn't listen, and the offer was rejected. And there it still is. Looks wonderful at the end of this church today. So, apart from the three Hercules pictures I've been talking about, several other Veroneses were bought by Cardenas for Harrow, including two large narrative paintings. And they were the Annunciation, or An Annunciation, and the Christ and the Centurion. And this, of course, is the greatest painting by Veronese today in the Prado, and this was given by Harrow to the king. This must be exactly the sort of painting that Philip was thinking of when he wrote the letter to Cardenas in 1646. The Annunciation, unfortunately, is lost, and it's not this picture because this was painted for the Escorial and is still there. But perhaps this gives an idea of the sort of picture that was in the Arundel collection and then went to Spain. An inventory of the Harrow collection of 1689 says that the holy figures had a foreground with columns, of course that's very common for Veronese, and a background of cypress trees. Actually, these aren't cypress trees, but you can imagine it would be very, very typical work by Veronese. But not all of Arundel's Veroneses went to Spain. For example, this painting, Vision of St. Helena, hasn't remained in England because it went first. It was sold in Amsterdam and was in Amsterdam for a decade or two in the collection of a collector, Italophile collector called Philips de Vlieen, before coming back to England, but not to the royal collection. Also in Arundel's collection was this, a fragment of a large altarpiece which Veronese had painted for the Church of San Francesco Grande in Padua, and it was in these years that it was vandalized, and the lower part of the painting was cut off. The upper part with Christ, they left in the church. There are different stories about how this came about. And in fact, one mischievous story circulating in the 18th century said that Arundel had commissioned this act of vandalism because he wanted it. I think that might be a little bit unfair, but it was probably done speculatively. The vandal, cut this out and then tried to find a buyer. But Arundel certainly knew that this was a fragment, and he knew Padua well. He had a villa there, and so would certainly have known where this had come from, and he didn't give it back to them. Now, this was bought by a pair of brothers called the Imranstedt brothers, who were in fact the nephews of a very important collector indeed, the German Cologne banker Eberhard Jabach, who was another of the beneficiaries of the spoils of the Civil War, many of which he sold to Cardinal Mazarin in Paris and ended up in the collection of Louis XIV. But rather surprisingly, Jabach didn't buy any pictures by Veronese, and so none of the Veroneses in the French royal collection seem to have come from Arundel, or indeed from any English collection. And it seems that Louis XIV preferred to go to look for, he loved Veronese and bought a lot of them, and he wanted to have, he tried to buy the huge wedding feast at Cana, which is indeed today in the Louvre, but wasn't bought there until Napoleon. But he did succeed in buying this from the church of from the refectory of the Church of the Servi in Venice. Well, so much for Arundel. So I'm turning now to the Duke of Buckingham, who is another major collector of art at the courts of James I and Charles I. This wonderful picture could have been in the beautiful exhibition here because it is only a sketch. It's an oil sketch for a larger picture, but I guess it couldn't come because it has only recently been in the Charles I exhibition in London, now in Fort Worth in Texas. Buckingham was a favorite courtier of both Charles and before him his father, James I, and he enjoyed a meteoric career. He came from almost nowhere, a sort of landed gentry, but he quickly ascended the ranks of the aristocracy. They showered honors on him, and you can see what a flamboyant personality he is. Rubens has captured his character absolutely perfectly. This kind of riding along on a prancing horse, completely nonchalant, with all these allegorical figures that Rubens was so good at, glorifying the Duke. Now, the Duke started collecting seriously in 1619, so that's after Arundel, but before Charles. And he was, by the time he was assassinated in 1628, so only 9 years later, he had accumulated 300 or more paintings, and his taste wasn't as broad as that of Arundel. He loved Venetian painting, and Rubens, of course, as well, who was a sort of honorary Venetian. But he's very much a personality. He's completely sort of lacking the refinement of Arundel as a collector. He was not a connoisseur. He just sort of followed fashion, and he had huge sums to spend as a result of the success he enjoyed with James and then Charles. He made extensive use of a curator, Balthazar Gerbier, who while Buckingham played politics in London, Gerbier went off to the continent with his purse full of money to buy pictures for Buckingham. In 1619, he went to Antwerp, where he bought at one go 11 paintings by Veronese from the recently deceased Duke of Arschot. And then a couple of years later, he went to Italy, where he bought what is really what was the jewel of his collection, the large, magnificent Ecce Homo by Titian. Now, there exist two inventories of the collection of Buckingham, and altogether he owned about 20 pictures by Veronese, and they included this highly erotic version of the subject, which was a little bit too erotic, actually, for the widow of Buckingham, who gave it to Charles in part exchange in 1634. So this sort of painting was obviously to Charles's taste, well, the subject as well as the artist. Now, unlike in the case of Arundel, the Veroneses that belong to Buckingham are mostly recognizable because most of them were bought en bloc by the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, who was the brother of the emperor and was the governor of the Spanish Netherlands. And Leopold Wilhelm bought all of the paintings that I've just mentioned that Buckingham had got from the Duke of Aarschot, showing scenes from the Old and New Testament. Now, not all of these are of the highest quality, and this one stands apart for its larger scale and its more complex composition and its very high quality. This is an outstanding early work by Veronese, and probably the finest to reach England before the end of the 18th century, because the other ex-Aarschot paintings are largely workshop quality, as one can see if you compare the Christ and the Centurion that had belonged to Buckingham with the larger, more beautiful version that had belonged to Arundel. You see, the composition is considerably simplified by this date. But they were, as a set, one can imagine that these 10 paintings by Veronese with really quite strong and rich colour looked quite magnificent in the picture gallery at York House, the London residence of the Duke of Buckingham, and again, help must have encouraged Charles and also Hamilton to invest in paintings by Veronese. Buckingham also had a taste for the work of a living painter, Orazio Gentileschi, and I think this is less evident here. He did own this, but in the Finding of Moses that I'm going to show in a moment, and. But his particular taste for Veronese is illustrated by a message that he sent to the Venetian government in 1624, but via the Venetian ambassador in London. Ambassadors are very often acting as the go-between between royal collectors and the cities where they wanted to buy paintings. He wrote, "The Duke of Buckingham desireth by any means possible to have certain pictures made by Paul Veronese that are in a certain room in the great library of St. Mark in Venice." And so he was almost certainly asking for the three large roundels. This is just one of them, but you can imagine these. This is just a view of the room. So there are three roundels by different painters. So he was proposing making holes in this wonderful ceiling so that he could have the three best of them by Veronese. Of course, just like the canons of San Giorgio in Brida, the Senate of Venice did not agree to this really insolent proposal, and the Veroneses remain to this day where they are. But I suggest that the idea of having a circular painting like this on a ceiling inspired Buckingham to commission from Rubens this, a circular ceiling painting glorifying the Duke of Buckingham. Unfortunately, this is another oil sketch by Rubens. The original doesn't survive anymore, but this was a composition meant for the ceiling of the one of the I think maybe the entrance hall in Buckingham's residence in London, and in Rubens met Buckingham in 1625 in Paris, which was when he painted the equestrian portrait, the sketch of which I showed earlier. And 3 years later, after his diplomatic mission to Spain to try to create peace between Spain and England, he moved on to London. By this time, Buckingham had been assassinated, but Rubens was deeply impressed by the collection that he saw. Now, 2 years before this, 1620 to 21, another Flemish painter had visited London and had access to the Buckingham collection, and this was Van Dyck. So this is one of the pictures that Buckingham commissioned from Van Dyck when he was in when the young Van Dyck was in London, 1620 to 21. Now, of course, one can see many artistic influences here. Most certainly Titian, most certainly Rubens, of course. But I think with this sort of narrow foreground, the white architecture, the sort of elegance, the sort of long white arms, I think, and the enjoyment of different textures, I think this is also indebted to Veronese. And I think maybe in particular to one of the Buckingham pictures. This is another one in the set. The story of Esther, where you also see the ruler King Ahasuerus up on a throne like Scipio, and a beautiful young woman being brought before him, and background architecture again of in this case, Palladian. This looks a little. This has got a touch of Bernini by this date. So, a magnificent display of paintings by Veronese at York House, the house of Buckingham, and both the activities of both Arundel and Buckingham as a collector had strongly influenced Charles, and he'd already acquired a reputation as a lover of painting before he became king in 1625. But it seems that what really spurred him on to become a great collector was this trip I've mentioned before to Madrid in 1623, when he could admire the Spanish royal collection and was given some examples of it. It was given some examples of Venetian painting by Philip, and then he continued to receive diplomatic gifts. Once he was king, from people who knew of this particular interest of his. But his greatest coup of all as a collector was, as is very well known, his acquisition in 1629 of almost the entire collection of the Dukes of Mantua. A very large collection, very, very rich in major masterpieces, including Titian, who had worked extensively for the Gonzaga family of Mantua in the 16th century. But Veronese was not a painter who had worked for the court at Mantua. Charles bought almost no works by Veronese from this source, and in fact, the inventory of the royal collection records and the records of the sales of it record only 5 paintings by Veronese, 2 of which I've already mentioned. Oh, sorry, I should have had this before, just to remind you of Charles. Anyway, move on. Yes, he owned these 2, one of which he had from Philip in 1623, and this he had from Buckingham, or Buckingham's widow, in 1634. But the other of these 5, the other Veronese that we can still identify, because 2 we can't identify, is this. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's just another example to show Charles's taste for, well, what purportedly mythological subjects, but actually for erotic subjects. It's not actually very good. It's just a version of a painting by Titian. But no, this a jewel of a painting, obviously here in the Prado, and perhaps the most beautiful of all the paintings by Veronese to come to England in these years, in these decades. It's blown up several times in this image on the screen. It's work that requires intimate viewing, and the delicacy of touch here reminds me of the 18th century, of Watteau, the Fête Galante, this sort of thing. And I think it reflects the aspect of Charles as a refined connoisseur rather than as a powerful ruler. Undoubtedly, Charles, as well as other collectors, are buying for show to impress people, particularly when it comes to equestrian portraits and that sort of thing. But very few people would see that. It would be his an intimate circle who would appreciate the beauty of this sort of picture. And this was also bought by Cardenas and passed on to Harrow, who then passed it on to Philip the IV. But it was acquired for Charles in Venice by his agent there, the Flemish merchant Daniel Nice. So altogether, Charles had very few paintings by Veronese, but at least 3 of the 5 were of very high quality and were very carefully selected. He, Nice knew that we can assume that Charles would appreciate a painting like this, and the other 2 paintings Charles had chosen in person. So it's rather surprising to find in one of the really very, very few contemporary comments on Charles's taste, it was said that he was not particularly attracted to Veronese. This reference occurs in a letter of 1637, which was addressed by the English ambassador in Venice, a man called Basil Fielding, to the Duke of Hamilton, who was in fact his brother-in-law. And Fielding writes, "I have seen 4 large pieces by Veronese." It's thought that they're probably these. These are 2 of a set of 4, then belonging to the Cucina family, but soon afterwards to be sold by them, and so probably already on the market by the 1630s. I've seen 4 large pieces by Veronese, which, although expensive, are of his best manners. But then he goes on to say, "I hear that he is not very acceptable to the king." Now, it's very hard to understand how Fielding had this impression. It is repeated by by historians of collecting, by historians of Charles I, because, as I say, it's one of the few comments we have on his particular taste. But I don't believe it. And I think it may be that Fielding had this impression because the year before he'd sent this painting to Hamilton in London, a painting of Esther, subject we've just seen, but a much larger picture, which has ended up now actually in the Uffizi as a result of an exchange with the Austrian imperial collections in the early 19th century. Now, this is not actually a great masterpiece at all. It's usually thought to be a workshop picture, and a lot of the details are repeated from other paintings by him. And this dog is repeated literally from one of the paintings for San Sebastiano in Venice. So it may be that Charles had seen this painting and thought, well, that's, yeah, all right, not enthusiastic, and that this message was conveyed to Fielding that Charles perhaps didn't like Veronese very much. But for me, this says more about Charles's refinement of taste than of any dislike of Veronese. Anyway, the influence of Veronese is very evident in one of the most important commissions in painting of the whole of Charles I's reign, and that is the ceiling paintings that Rubens executed for the banqueting house in Whitehall. So here is the Rubens here in exterior. By the way, many of the sketches for this ceiling are in the present Rubens exhibition here. But I think it's very evident that Rubens, who of course would have known this ceiling by Veronese in Venice, adopted his general design from it. In fact, his very particular design in at least one case, which I can't read very well from here. I think it's this one. Anyway, it's the influence of this canvas in particular. So here is a kind of a pseudo or second-hand Veronese here at the heart of London, Whitehall. And but also, I mentioned now Gentileschi, and I think there is may well be some connection here that Gentileschi would have known this picture when it was still in London, and this is of course a wonderful virtuoso display of silks and other fabrics of the pharaoh's daughter in a landscape. Of course, they're completely different scale, and Gentileschi had many other sources besides Veronese, but I think it's quite interesting that he certainly would have known this picture. Also, the feathery trees are so typical of Veronese. I find in the Gentileschi, and then also another painter, Van Dyck. One of the most beautiful of all his mythologies, painted for the king, or perhaps for the queen, Henrietta Maria. Always the name of Titian is mentioned in this connection, and not wrongly, but I think that the decorative elegance here and the sort of silvery colours also owes a lot to Veronese. Now, coming now and more briefly to the other leading collector of the later part of the reign of Charles, the Duke of Hamilton. Hamilton was in a perfect position to raise his profile as a courtier and to gain the favour of the king as a collector through his brother-in-law, who, as I said, was the ambassador in Venice. And so Fielding sent lists of paintings that were on the market to Hamilton in London, and as we've just seen, in 1636, Hamilton bought the Esther, which is a workshop picture by Veronese. But in 1638, Hamilton bought no less than 200 paintings by the important Venetian collector Bartolomeo della Nave, including 6 scenes from the Old Testament and the New Testament. So a sort of analogy to the series that had already been bought by Buckingham. And at least 2 of these, the mythologies, the mythologies show Veronese at his poetic best in this, showing these mythological scenes in a sort of poetic, woodland. But then in these arrived in 1639, but then the Civil War broke out in 1642, and in 1649 Hamilton was executed only a month after his royal master, and virtually his entire collection was bought by the Archduke in Brussels. Again, Hamilton's Veroneses are really quite easy to trace because of inventories and because most of them went to Vienna. And in this 10 years here in the Prado, you can see several of the Veroneses. There's one that belonged to this set of scenes from the Old and New Testament, which had been bought from Bartolomeo della Nave by Hamilton. Well, I've been talking about 4 main collections, but there were a number of other smaller collections in London in these years, which also included works by Veronese. For example, in 1651, the Spanish envoy in London, Count Fuensaldana, sent 44 pictures to Harrow from unnamed English collections. So unfortunately, we don't know who they belong to, but 2 anyway have ended up in the Prado. They came from English collections, and then 2 more also came to Spain at this time, but later left. They've ended up in the Doria collection in Genoa. And also with these was an Ecce Homo, which in 1667 was in the sacristy of the Escorial and was described as one of Veronese's finest pictures, but unfortunately soon afterwards it disappeared, so it's gone. We don't know where it is. So to sum up, there were about 60 paintings by Veronese in England before the Civil War. Some absolute masterpieces, others less good, but still quite attractive. And of all of these, of this 60, only one stayed in England and was not re-exported to continental Europe. And so this painting that he received as a gift from Philip in 1623 is today in Edinburgh. And the next 150 years showed really very little appreciation of Veronese in England, and this is in absolute contrast to France. The kings of France, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and the Dukes of Orleans were totally in love with Veronese and bought huge amounts of them, and a large number of the works, all the Italian works from the Orleans collection came to London at the end of the 18th century, and so it was then that Veronese's critical fortunes in England started to revive. And this opens another chapter of the taste for Veronese in England. Thank you.